The words we have are the only words available to us. The words we know are the only tools available to us to, number one, interpret what's going on, to interpret what's being said, and to express your heart and your mind. Now, if you can't interpret well, and if you can't express well, you can imagine what a deterrent that is to the good life and the extra treasures, the extra feelings, awareness, riches, power, influence. So it's very important to have a good vocabulary. So I would ask you, one of the most important books in your library should be the dictionary. I've got a good question. How long do you want it to take to get good at what you do? You say not very long. Then you've got to do it often. Do it often. Repetition starts the skill. Now, it also must be repetition with the objectivity of getting better. Because sometimes it's easy to be casual just about repetition and not get much better. How about the man who's been talking for 10 years, but he's making the same verbal errors he made 10 years ago? Or 10 years ago he said, I don't quite know how to put this. 10 years later he's saying, I don't quite know how to put this. We say, hey, 10 years is too long not to know how to put it. We can give you 10 hours not to know how to put it. You can stretch our patience and take 10 days not to know how to put it, but we can't give you 10 years. 10 years is too long not to make enough progress in better language skill. So, repetition with purpose. The purpose is to grow and to change, to develop, to expand, to make progress. Emotions, feelings, phrases, sentences, paragraphs. It's very important now to be able to translate it. Learning to say it well. Now, this is a whole subject in itself. This is worth a weekend of study. Let me just give you a short list of suggestions on learning to say it well. Number one, repetition. It just takes practice. I don't know any substitute for the practice. To learn any skill, you've just got to go through it again and again and again. My first attempt at lecturing, especially outside my own comfortable business circles, was pretty tough. Learning to say it well was a struggle for me. But I kept at it and kept at it. And now I've gotten better. I do one seminar called Challenge to Succeed. It's about 4 hours long, and I can do it without any notes. Every once in a while a person comes and says, you lectured this evening for 4 hours without any notes. How can you do that? I said, it's very simple. I've done it a few thousand times. We call that simplicity. You just do it over and over and often. Next is vocabulary. Saying it well is proper choice of words. To build my early vocabulary, I used to put 3 or 4 words I didn't know on a card, put it up on the sun visor on my car. Back in those days, I traveled a lot by car. Sure enough, by the end of the day, I'd mastered 2 or 3 words. Vocabulary. Vocabulary is a way of seeing. One reason for vocabulary is to interpret what we see, to interpret what we hear. The vocabulary of the mind grapples with the words and the images that come to our mind. Now, if you've got a poor set of words and skills and tools with which to interpret, you can imagine the errors and the mistakes you'll make in judgment. And since vocabulary is a way of seeing, if you can't see well, you can imagine the errors you can make and how they compound as life unfolds. We do 2 things with vocabulary. We interpret and we express. Here's some other parts to saying it well. Sincerity, from the heart, with noble intent, wishing to bring value. That adds immeasurably to your ability to speak well, communicate well. There's no substitute for sincerity. I can forgive you for a mistake in judgment, but I can't forgive you for a mistake in intent. Next key part to saying it well, brevity. Part of the key is to be brief. You can't linger too long, I've discovered in my lecturing and speaking around the world. You can't linger too long on any one point. I used to tell stories too long. I'd get involved in a long story on and on. By the time I hit the punchline, people forgot how it started. Now it doesn't make sense. Too long. Here's why brevity is important. The human attention span is short. You haven't got long to get it said before you lose your audience. Now, the best practice I know of here is practice on the kids, because their attention span is really short. You talk to kids for 30 seconds, they say, how long is this going to take? Right? I mean, they're already bent out of shape, right? Looks like you're going to take forever to get to the point, get it said. Sometimes we try to make up in words what we lack in self-confidence. So part of the key to being brief is personal development, personal growth, personal awareness, understanding self-worth. Now you can use the economy of words. And this is a good position to be in, that what you are adds so much weight to what you say that you don't have to say very much. But brevity is a good point on saying it well. Here now starts the power of what we say, intensity. Part of the strength of what we say is the words we choose. The greater part of the strength of what we say is the emotions that are loaded into the words. Here's what has power unmatched, words loaded with emotion. There is no greater power. Words have an effect, but words loaded with emotion have an incredible effect. My words may reach you, but if I can't touch you with my spirit, if I can't touch you with my emotions, my feelings, my beliefs, then I probably haven't affected you very much. The feelings, the belief, the commitment, all that I am, if I can put more of what I am into what I say, no telling what miracle I can wrought. No telling how much of an effect I can be. Real persuasion comes from putting you into what you say. But now here's part of the clue, and we call these extra refinement of leadership skills. Learning to measure your emotions. That's very important, to learn to measure your emotions. You don't need an atomic explosion for a minor point. Enough, but not too much. We call this understanding how to measure the flow of your emotions to cover a point. Okay, but if it needs heavyweight stuff, you reach and get it. If it needs a milder approach, you learn how to measure it in milder, easier terms. But it's very important to measure your emotions, your feelings. Now, what do we mean by intensity and emotions? Here it is. All of your experiences and how they've affected you. That's the sum total of your emotional content. Where you've been and what you've heard and what you've seen and who you've met and this whole panorama of life experiences for you up until now and how you felt about all that. That we call the sum total of your emotions. Now, the key is to learn how to measure all that and put it in effective amounts into the words you choose. So here's the key to effective communications. Well-chosen words loaded with well-measured emotions. Next is style. And there's all kinds of parts to style, from body language and gestures to facial expressions and eyes and emotion. But style is very important. Here's part of the clue. It's not just the matter you cover, it's the manner in which you cover the matter. Style is important to attract someone's attention, to emphasize the point. Now, I've got a couple of good points here on style. Be a student of style, but don't just copy someone's style. Make sure that the study of style becomes distinctly you. But it is also important to be a student of style. How people speak well, be a student of that. And then borrowing bits and pieces from people you admire and the way they can communicate. Then make sure that all of that blended into you becomes your own distinctive style. But style is very important. Now, there's a variety of styles. But it's important to study your own style and say, how am I coming across in style? Should I learn to emphasize more? Should I learn to be more emphatic? All these things concerning style. Read your audience. It's very important to read and to pick up the signals of what's happening with your audience. Now, when I first started lecturing outside my business circles, I had some problems here. Reading my audience. I think my early audiences, they all could have left halfway through and I'd have never known it. I was so intent on what I was saying that I was a bit unconscious of what was going on out there. Then I finally learned to look up, to watch and see what's happening. We call this reading what's happening. Now, it's also just as important to read a person, to read a child. If you want to be effective, you got to get the feedback. You've got to pick up the signals to know whether to be stronger or whether to ease off, whether to change stories, change words, change language. All of this comes by a good ability to read your audience. So let me give you some clues on reading. Number one is simply to listen. Part of reading is listening. You pick up a lot of clues as to what else to say, what all to say by being a good listener. From early times, I think we've learned to be a good speaker, you've got to be a good listener. That's where you pick up the information, is to listen well, especially in a private conversation, a more informal conversation. Good listening habits. That's part of reading. Number two, you've got to read what you see. Part of it is just being conscious, right? Body language, reading what you see. Here's what we teach in leadership skills. Don't mistake courtesy for consent. In a polite society, we've learned sometimes to be courteous, but that doesn't mean we buy the story. With somebody being polite, smiling and nodding, you've got to make sure you don't misread that and stop short of the full persuasion. Don't mistake kindness for acceptance. In a polite society, we've learned to be kind, but that doesn't mean we've accepted. So part of this is a little more subtle in reading in a polite society, whether or not somebody is buying your argument, if they're being persuaded by your presentation. So body language, picking up those signals. Now here's the one that's probably the most effective, but it's probably the most elusive. Reading the emotional signals. This is an area probably where the women have it over the men. Picking up the emotional signals. I think men can learn these skills, but I think women have a lot of this automatically. But it's something we all have to learn. Emotional signals, picking up the signals of whether to change your language, be sharper or to be softer, to go after a problem or to ease back and give it time to soak. Part of this is just picking up the feelings, picking up the emotions, being sensitive to the situation. This is not easy stuff. This is extra learning stuff, extra skills. But this is called summit learning, for those extra measures of rewards that come from communicating by learning these extra skills. Very important to read your audience. How are you coming across? What is the effect? From a child to an auditorium full of people. Reading. Practice the art every chance you get. And try to say it well. It's easy to be lazy in language all day and not practice the gift and the art. Then when it comes time to make an important talk, to appeal to a child, we're missing the words and missing the sharpness and missing the vocabulary simply because we lack the practice of doing it every day. If you want to get good at communication, you have to be aware of doing it every day as a practice session of getting better, so that when the real important occasions arise, you will have the gift and you'll have the style, you'll have the sharpness and the clarity and the substance and the emotion. I have a key phrase for you. Actions are no substitute for words. Don't fail to say it. Now, we've heard the old expression, words are no substitute for action. That's true. Talk, never act. That's not good. But this also isn't good. Act, and never talk. Here's the next part of a good presentation. It's what we call logic and reason. If you're trying to persuade a child, talk to a child, or talk to an audience, or if you're trying to talk to a customer, part of any presentation is the logical part, the facts and the figures, and the numbers and the dimensions. And we won't linger too long here, because here's my point on logic and reason. It's got to be brief. We need some facts, but only enough facts to start the decision-making process. You got to beware not to cover too many facts. I'm sure we've all heard the expression, it's possible to talk somebody into buying, keep on talking, talk them out of buying. Here's where this problem usually occurs. Even if it's a child, you can talk a child into deciding, and then you keep on talking, and then they undecide. We talk past. Too much logic, too much reason. We need just enough logic and reason so that it starts to make sense, not so that you understand it all. How many facts do you need? About a half dozen. And if somebody makes the mistake of going beyond the half dozen, here's what they're going to do. Lose their audience. So you got to make sure you don't get into too wide range of facts and logic. Because here's why. Most decisions are made emotionally. We need just enough logic so that it makes sense, but we're going to do it probably out of emotion. So the key is to be brief. With logic, reasons, facts, because too much of anything is too much, right, at one time. In a wider range of teaching all of this, here's the reaction you want from identification. Me too. You just want the reaction for somebody to say, me too. I understand what that's like. I've been there. So part of it is trying to translate your experiences into words so that someone will identify with it and say, me too. Here's a reaction you don't want. So what? Now, it's easy if you're not careful to load your presentation with a lot of so whats. Mr. Schoaf, who only went to the 8th grade in school, but he gave me the classic point to ponder here when I was 25 years old. And it was put in such simple terms, I've never forgotten it. Let me put it in those same terms for you. Here's what he said. Learn to express, not impress. That was so helpful for me because it's easy to engage in language just designed to impress instead of express. But Schoaf said if you want to touch somebody, learn to express. Sincerity from the heart, not impress. Impress builds a gulf. Express builds a bridge. Identification. This is a whole wide subject in itself. The identification question is, what will make me real to my audience? What will make me real to the child? Identification is building a bridge. If you're meeting somebody for the first time, it's simply getting acquainted. Building a bridge, making contact. Here's one of the clues. Find something you have in common. That's where you start, something you have in common. Here's the clue to really affecting people. Start with where they are before you try to take them to where you want them to go. Meet people where they are. If somebody's hurting, you got to meet in the hurt. If somebody's in trouble, you got to start with the trouble. The key is to start where somebody is. If they're in trouble, you got to start with trouble. You can't talk success if somebody's in trouble. You got to start, first of all, talking trouble. So that when somebody is stricken in the heart, and you've had this experience, maybe not as deeply, but somewhat of an experience of being stricken in the heart. When you meet somebody and you're trying to help them, you can talk about being stricken in the heart, and it'll have substance, it'll have meaning, it'll have depth. And you start there, and then start building the bridge and start building the path towards solving the problem. Identification. Part of identification is proper word choice. Jesus said to his disciples one day, today I'm going to teach you how to fish. What an important choice of words, fish. Who is he talking to? Fishermen. We call that brilliant. He didn't say, I'm going to teach you how to recruit. No, what do they know from recruit? These fishermen don't know recruit. And if you keep insisting on saying recruit to fishermen, we call you naive. You got to change your vocabulary. He said, I now wish to teach you how to become fishermen. Now, see, they understood that language. He said winning people is a lot like fishing. Now, see, they understood that story. If it's like fishing, we can figure it out. Here's the next clue to identification. Beware of using inside lingo on the outside world. Sometimes inside, some little catchy phrases become comfortable, but outside, they become strange. You got to learn to shift gears into an appropriate word choice depending on your audience. It's called the gift of language in a variety of awareness to learn how to choose the right words and the right phrases depending on who you're talking to. We call this awareness. We call this being non-lazy. We call this being sharp in perception to know who you're talking to and how to choose the words that'll make sense. Identification. You've got to identify with the sorrow by recalling your own sorrow. Identify with the joy by recalling your own joy. Identify with the difficulty by rehearsing your own difficulty. Here's one of the best clues in learning to better identify. Go back over your own life and make a study of your own life, your circumstances, your feelings, your awareness. Some of the stories you haven't told for a long time. Some of the experiences you've had. Now, sometimes when you've freshly come from an experience, it isn't that easy to translate it and it isn't that easy to talk about it. But as the time passes and you can take a more thoughtful approach to your experiences, the key is not to lose the intensity of it, but to become more educated in using the intensity of your experiences to weave into the next conversation. And by the gift of language and emotion, touch somebody's life, reach somebody, affect somebody, persuade somebody. How do you identify with a child? It's tough. What if the adult is 40 and the child is 12? We call that a long bridge. How do you bridge the gap between 40 and 12? It isn't easy. In fact, we used to call it the Generation gap. And how do you manage the skills that builds the bridge over the generation gap? Well, there's some answers here. Here's number one. Remember when you were 12. You've just got to have the skill to go back. But you just got to go back and relive that. Let it smite you one more time. Let it hit you and let it hurt you. Because, see, to really affect people, you got to be moved. And you've got to be touched. And without moving and touching of life experiences, whatever emotion it calls for, there are some people you can't reach. Here's another key way to reach the kids. Read all their books. Here's what it's called. Do your homework. Lack of homework shows in the marketplace. Lack of homework shows at home. See, if a child has read this book, and I read the book, one of the great places we can meet is in the book. I say to the child, remember the story where? Right away they're going to be impressed that I've done my homework. And the kid says, did you read that book? I said, yes, I read all those books. They say, wow. But I say, remember the story where? They say, I remember that story. I say, well, that's about like now. Not exactly, but it's pretty close. And the child says, oh, I see, I see. Now they can see because we went back to the common seeing that was in the book. But if you miss the book and don't do your homework, I'm telling you, you'll miss a chance to identify. Here's the big challenge, identifying with somebody who's not like you in color or religion or circumstance. How do the successful reach and touch somebody who isn't successful? Well, first of all, they've got to talk about their struggle, not their success. Let me give you the clue to good identification. Your struggle will more often identify than your success. If you've got an hour to talk and you spend 59 minutes on your success story, we call that building a gulf, not a bridge. You've got to spend most of the time on your struggle, most of the time on your fears, most of the time on your apprehensions, most of the time you hesitated, most of the time you were about to give it up. You've got to spend some time on that. That's called identification and building a bridge. Then take them by the hand and then show them your success when it has meaning because it came from struggle, it came from decision, and it came maybe from heartbreak, and it came maybe from the same position the person finds themselves in that you're talking to. Identification. What makes you real? That's so important. We must be gifted with words if we want the full treasure of life. So practice every occasion you get. And then put the gift of words to work to go along with the activity. And you will start to sense this whole growing excitement about using language to affect somebody, to translate feelings of heart and mind. And the response you're going to get and the results you're going to get starts growing in measurable quantities. I'm just asking you to take the extra time to engage in these arts and practices. The gift of language, communications, affecting people with words.